Hello, my name's Tom Chaplin from Master Light Photography Workshops and Tours, and today we're doing an image review of landscape photography. First up, we've got Simon Roth. I just want to point out that the format for all of these, the image reviews are going to be the same, so I'm going to roughly go over the photography elements of the photographs. So we're going to talk about composition, we're going to talk about where you're standing when the image is taken, what the main pros of the image are, like what you should be aiming to accentuate during your edit, and things like that. And then we'll go into the editing processing of the actual image that we've got in front of us. So I'll try and balance what I'm offering whilst I'm talking about it. So let's get going. So we've got this image here from Simon. First of all, I'd just like to say that I think it's majestic. I love the light in the scene. I think the fact that you've got light rays, which are quite a rare thing to capture in camera, really helps this picture. It makes it stand out from just your sort of standard landscape photo and adds a sort of dynamic element to it. So really good timing on it. The exposure you captured in camera is not bad. It's on the dark side, which is fine, because it means looks like you've pretty much kept all of the brightest points in your picture. So that's good. Yeah, so I think there's a lot going for you in this picture, but the couple of things I'd say about composition, I'm just going to use my pen tool here so I can sort of show you what I mean. So really, everything above this line is what's particularly interesting. So this scene that we've got going on at the top is what's actually very interesting about the picture. The bottom third here, this tree's okay, but the bottom third here particularly isn't really offering much as part of your composition in terms of adding to what the photo is about. The photo is about the majesty of the landscape, the amazing light quality, and the sort of texture and detail in the sky. And everything below here is just not helping you with that. So the first thing I might suggest, if we're going to be just talking about this picture, would be a crop. However, if I was here in this location, I'd probably try and stand somewhere here or maybe over here, just to see if the vantage points are less complex. You know, it gives you a much more simple view of the scene. I think that would really benefit this picture, just to make it easier on the eyes and make it very clear what it's about. But yeah, there's nothing inherently wrong with what you've done. I just think that it could be improved by standing in a different location. Or even potentially just having a longer lens, so you could cut out a lot of this and make your picture, I don't know, something like that with a longer lens might be more interesting. Or let me just clear this. Or even going for a panorama with a long lens, you could get something like that. Again, might be really interesting. I think there's things you could do in this location that would really help it. Right, so let's have a look at our edit. Let me just pop this way. Okay, so working on the image that we've got here, there's two things that really stand out to me. One, that it's too dark. It's probably about a stop dark, maybe slightly more, so I'm just going to bring that up. Remember, I'm working on a JPEG file, because that's what I asked for people to send me, because RAWs are obviously very big. So there's only so much I can do with it, but I'm giving you this information so that you can apply it to your RAWs in your Lightroom. So let's increase the exposure. Let's go up to as much as a stop is probably going to be about right. So yeah, that's looking a bit better. Our sky is too bright at the moment, but we will deal with that in a second. And then the next thing is it's too cold. The reason you can tell it's cold is because if you look at your histogram up here, you've got a lot of blues in your midtones and highlights. And naturally, unless you've got a blue light source, so say you're in a studio with a blue gel on your strobe, in most scenarios, blues will only exist in your shadows if your white balance is correct. So as I drag this towards warm, you'll see that blue sort of shrinks as I keep going with it. Even as high as that, it's starting to look more accurate. You can see that the blues that were there, let me just show you a before and after. The blues that were in here have just been nullified a little bit, which definitely helps this a little bit. And the other thing is, having done that, is that it's ever so slightly green. So I'll just add a little bit of magenta. So not very much, just +3. It might be more than that. The numbers are going to be different with the raw file. but just some magenta to cancel out the amount of yellow we just added in. Okay, cool. So that's good. Next, now we've increased the exposure, we're going to need to reduce the highlights. So I'm just going to drop those back down to, let's say, about -50. And let's check our whites. Yeah, they can just be dropped a little bit. And then it's always worth checking our blacks and our shadows, just so we don't lose the contrast that we had by flattening our image. So something like that's probably okay for that edit. I might add a little bit of dehaze if you've got access to it on in CC, because that'll sort of help bring out the sky. And then maybe the last thing I would do is a graduated filter. So I'm just coming down from the top left corner with a graduated filter. You can press M to bring that up, or just click the key up here. And with that, I'm just going to reduce the exposure slightly, just by 0.2 of a stop, something like that. And then add some dehaze to the sky. Now, as I add the dehaze, you're going to see it does some funny things with the clouds, particularly with color. So I'm going to be careful with it. You know, I'll go to say 15, add a bit more a bit more detail, texture to the sky. That works really well. And then if, in this case, I don't think we need to do it, but if it does overdo it with the color, because it's adding some saturation when you use dehaze, you can always take some of the color back out with the saturation slider. So if you like the detail the dehaze is giving you but don't like the color, then leave the dehaze on and then just reduce the color effect with saturation. So let's just drop that by about -7, and we've added 17 dehaze. You can change the angle of this if you want to. I think maybe something like that might be a bit better for this picture. Oops, oopsie daisy. Just move that up a little bit. Nope, that'll be fine. Okay, yeah, so that's what that would be. Crop is the only other thing. I might just think about bringing this up to just above this thing that's down here, or just above the wall that's in the bottom right down here. So maybe we'll go just above the wall just to take that out and hit enter. Yeah, it focuses you in a little bit more. And then I might spot remove this rock. So make your spot remove slightly bigger than the object and pick somewhere else to sample from. Let's go for, yep, you wouldn't know that had happened. There we go, that just tidies up that a bit. So yeah, so that might be what I would do with this picture. Quickly show you the before and after. There you go. So yeah, I think there's things you can do with this picture that will bring it out. But as I said, there's also probably things in location you could do to improve this. Thank you for that one, Simon. Right, so next we've got second image from Simon. Let me have a look. Yep, cool. So again, I'll go through the same process. So I'm imagining this was shot possibly on the same walk, as the obviously the surroundings are very similar. So I picked this image. So Simon sent me a few to choose from, and I picked this image because I think that it has potential, but didn't quite work out in this picture to the extent that you maybe hope it would. So one, I think that the subject matter is really interesting. I think like the pinky white blossom trees are a really interesting subject, particularly in this kind of landscape that's quite harsh, or at least to some degree quite harsh, you know, very green and seemingly quite rocky. To have these sort of pinky white plants growing is interesting. So I think that you've got the eye for the subject was definitely there. But I think where you're stood is the biggest factor as to why this doesn't fully work as a picture, or for me, I think could be massively improved. And that is purely because I think if you were to literally just stand here or here, the other side of this bush, this image, it will be massively improved. This bush is not adding anything to you, to this picture at all. It's just a distraction really, because you want your picture to be about the sort of the anomaly of the landscape, which are these trees, rather than this bush that you sort of have everywhere in your scene anyway. So yeah, it's just a big distraction. And, and as I always say about photography, I think if everything that's left in your picture needs to be intentional, it needs to be adding to the picture rather than detracting. And for me, this bush being left in here is distracting. Yeah, and then the other thing I would say is when you've got trees like this, again, adding to the idea of simplifying your scene, I'd look to maybe find one tree that you could photograph, or at most maybe a set of 3 trees, something like that, that would become the bulk of your composition, would become something that, has some rhythm to the picture, or it's purely about the solitude of the single tree. It's the only tree like this in this landscape. Whether it is or not, you can tell a story with your photography through being more selective in your compositions. Cool. So now I've talked about that. An edit on this that I would do, I'll quickly go through. First of all, it's dark. Again, similar to the last one. It's about a stop dark, so I'm going to go to 0.9. And it is slightly cold. And then I'll say something about histograms for landscape photography. So I'm just going to warm it a little bit. It doesn't need as much as the last picture. You can see that's overdoing it. So let's go to about just over 10, something like that's going to be good. Cool, that's a good starting point. And I would also then probably crop the picture. This bottom corner is doing nothing for you, so maybe something like, remember, it doesn't need to be totally straight either because it's all on a hill. You might be able to do something like this with it. Yeah, potentially that's a more interesting picture. Yeah, you just have a play around with it on the full-size RAW file, but potentially that's more interesting than what you had before because you've removed the bush. And the last thing I'd say is it's better now we've done this crop, but on landscape photography, your histogram likes to be quite spread out because you want to have detail throughout your scene. So for a portrait or something that's stylized, or street photography, or many other genres of photography, having a contrasty histogram, meaning data predominantly at the beginning and the end of your histogram, the left and the right, with less data in the middle, can be good. It depends on your image, but for landscape photography, largely you want it to be doesn't have to be evenly spread, but slightly more evenly spread usually works quite well because you're looking to have front to back sharpness by using a deeper aperture, and also that would be mirrored in your editing. So you're going to want to have, normally you'd bring your shadows up a bit and you might bring your highlights back a bit just to sort of squish your histogram together, meaning that you have a bit more mid-tone information. But, particularly this image, it might not be necessary. But yeah, so they're just the small changes I'd make to this. It'd be the crop, the exposure, and the white balance are the biggest things here. Cool. Thank you for those 2 images, Simon. So next we've got Debbie Smith, who sent 2 images from her trip to Oman. Both fantastic photos. Clearly has an excellent eye for this. And yeah, I just absolutely love the 2 pictures that you sent in. However, I think there's things we can do, particularly in the edit, because I think largely the captures are pretty good. But there's definitely things in the edit we can do to add some more pizzazz or highlight certain bits, and really just polish the edit that you've done. So what would I want to say about this picture? So first of all, obviously the reflection is really nice. The lines in the picture add a sense of structure and form that is really nice, that prevails through your picture, and obviously that is then reflected in the floor. So all of these lines drag you down through the picture, so top to down, which is top to bottom, which is really nice. And then on top of that, you've got these leading lines that lead you all the way along and through the picture, which again works really nicely. So really nice capture, good angle to have captured it at. So you should be very pleased about that. The only critique, which I'm sure you've already noticed, is the fact that we've cut off the pole at the top, which is a shame. But I would probably just use a spot removal to potentially remove the pole so it doesn't look like you've cut it off. And it'll be a bit less distracting that way. Not that it necessarily is, it's obviously I'm a photographer looking at another photographer's work, so I'm going to notice these things, but the general public may not. So it's up to you whether you want to take that extra step. I'll quickly do that now. So what do we want to do? So we want to get rid of this, and then with the spot remove, just make our spot remove small, like that. Something like that, and then copy in some sky. There we go. You'd never know, and we haven't cut off the spire anymore, so if you want to do that you can, completely up to you. Okay, right, so the things we can do in the edit with this picture are exposure is slightly dark, not by very much, but it's a little bit dark. We can add a little bit more contrast, and we can definitely add some selective color, which I think is going to be good. And then by making it less dark, we're also going to add a little bit more dynamic range. And you could potentially play with a crop, but I don't think it's necessary. The only thing I'm definitely going to suggest you do is to come down to your transform tool and just hit auto and just align it and straighten everything up. You can always try full, but in this case, it's done an excellent job. Hasn't quite worked. So I would just go with auto, and it's just going to help straighten up and align these things. You can see by doing that, we've actually managed to recrop the top of our spire again. So let's just grab that again. There we go. And there we go. We've replaced this spire with some more blue sky, so that's not a problem. Okay. Right, so what would I do? First, I'm going to increase the exposure up by, let's go for plus 0.4. That looks about good. I'm going to reduce the exposure a little bit to compensate. I'm going to increase the shadows a little bit. Check our white point. White point's pretty much fine. Black point, again, is pretty much fine. We want to make sure we're keeping the punch of these two. And then I'd add a little bit of dehaze, because that's going to pick out a little bit more detail. It's going to sort of make the clouds pop a little bit more. And it's going to make some of these black to highlight transitions pop a little bit more. So that's a good thing to add. Clarity, you could play with adding a little bit of clarity. I probably wouldn't really mess with it, because you want to maintain all your beautiful colors, and clarity sort of desaturates your picture a bit. So maybe don't worry about that too much. And then I would add a bit of vibrance. So I'm just going to add, what do we want to go with it? Maybe 20 or so, just to add a pop to the blue sky. And then finally, if you think the changes we've made have made it not as contrasty as you want, you can always add a little bit more contrast back in at this stage. And something like that is good. I think your white balance is about right. It feels maybe ever so slightly cold, but that may be to do with my screen. No, I think it's about right as it is. So yeah, that would be what I would do with that picture. But yeah, really nice capture, Debbie. The timing of the lady walking is excellent as well, and obviously the reflection really makes this image pop. So good job on that one. Okay, next one. Yeah, so what can I say about this? I absolutely love it. The colors, the richness of this picture is beautiful. There isn't much to say other than I really enjoy this picture, and I'd love to see it up on a wall somewhere. In print, I can imagine this would be beautiful. It's wonderfully sharp. The colors are all crisp. Your capture was excellent. Your exposure was really good for this, to make sure you haven't blown or particularly lost any detail that you didn't want to lose. So really good job on that. The first thing I'd quickly point out is it looks like you probably did your editing in 8-bit rather than 16-bit, which you may want to, I won't go into all of that now, but basically 8-bit will give your image a higher color render, more colors to choose from when it's rendering the preview picture for you. And then when you export as a JPEG, it's going to convert it back to 8-bit anyway. But by editing in 16-bit, you will not get any of this banding that you've got in the sky. So if you were to edit in 16-bit, then export as 8-bit, you would not have this banding issue that you've got here. Whereas if you were to edit, as I'm sure you have done, edit in 8-bit and then export in 8-bit, you will have a banding issue. And that's just because all of the colors are so similar to each other in the sky. You've got this blue transition to a, like a dark blue to a light blue. It's just struggled a little bit with that really minute transition. So that'll just be a tip I'd give you for that. Just Google how to edit in 16-bit, and that will help you out. Okay, cool. So first thing I'm going to do is increase the exposure just a little bit. It actually needs quite a bit of exposure pop. You can really see, so this is your histogram, like your mid-tone information is sat very dark. So the aim of this exposure is to bring this up a little bit. We don't want to overdo it. We want it to still clearly be evening time. So I'm just going to increase by half a stop, and then I'm just going to drop the highlights back a little bit just to compensate for the exposure increase we just added. And transform is the other big thing for this picture. So let's just go to auto and let's just get that feeling about right for you. Yeah, let's just go for auto. That looks like it's about good. Just straighten up all the towers, make sure they're all perfectly straight. And that's really, really nice. I think your temperature and tint are all good. And I mean, you could play around with adding more contrast, like particularly in the dark areas to this picture if you wanted to. But on the whole, it was just slightly dark, and the highlights and blacks could do with a bit of a small shift. And then the transform tool. The only other thing you could play with would be the hue of your color palette in here. So not that there's anything wrong with it, but because you've got all of these warm tones in the bottom, that might be a really nice thing to do. Yeah, so really nice shot, Debbie. I don't really have too much to suggest with this picture. It's beautiful. Your exposure was excellent. I'd maybe would have liked to see a wider angle version of this if that was possible, just to give the towers a bit more room, maybe give a little bit more of a sense of scale by leaving some more space for them. But yeah, I can't really fault this too much. It was really, really nice. Fantastic photo. Well done. So next we've got Oliver Smith. He sent this image across to me, just asking for some general feedback, and I said, do you want me to include it in the video? And so here we are. I think it's nice. I like the mood of the picture. The exposure is good. The composition is fine. I think it can be improved, but on the whole, this is not a bad picture at all. There's just things you could definitely, could have done with your photography, particularly the composition, and then two, there's some small things you can do with your edit just to accentuate or sort of finish off the picture a little bit more. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is where you are stood. So this, for me anyway, remember this is all my opinion, this part of this image is almost irrelevant, other than the fact that it sort of matches the color of this. Otherwise, I don't think that this is really doing very much for you. What I would have loved to have seen from this picture would be for you to be stood here, or even further along, something like that, and just photographing this way, straight across. Very similar composition. I still want to see all of the sky, etc., etc. But I want that, potentially that, to be your frame, which is obviously means that the water is going to take up the bottom corner of your frame. And that's going to make this a little bit more minimal, which I think, again, can really benefit landscape photography. We can get bogged down in making it too complicated. And also the reflection. You can see there's a small reflection of the house in here. What's going on here? Sorry about that. So you can see there's a small reflection of the house down here. And if you could get that, you can see here as well and here. If you can get that as the bottom of your frame, I think that this could be a much more powerful picture than it is currently. And then the other thing I would say is composition-wise, I think there's an opportunity here, and I would do it with a crop, but not having that side of the image up here. Maybe it's funny. So basically, everything in this corner I think is valuable for your picture, but I think these houses and the bottom are not necessarily valuable to your picture. I think that it adds a lot of clutter, and for me, I want to be looking at this house. That seems to be where my eye is drawn, and so I want you to make the picture around that one house. Maybe your frame could be something like this, or even wider if you wanted it to be. Something like that I think would be far more powerful than having the big spread that you've got at the moment. But yeah, that's just my opinion, but that would probably be the way I would have approached photographing the picture. Okay, so on with the edit. So in terms of your edit, there's just a couple of things. First off, I would probably crop it. So I would look at going to crop tool and probably just cropping out those houses on the side. Something like that is better. I might even consider going to an 8x10. So something right up like that. Feels a bit stronger to me than if you had all of it in. Even something like that feels a bit better too. Maybe you want to keep some of that rolling hill in there, so maybe something like that. But yeah, have a play with it and see what works for you. You could even massively reduce the bottom and make it top heavy. That could work really well as well. So just have a play around with that crop, but I think removing the town on the right would be valuable for this picture. The next thing I do is white balance. Is slightly cold. So again, as I said before, you've got lots of this blue like in your highlight end, which tells you your image is cold. So I would just add a little bit, not too much, because we don't want to ruin the colder mood of the picture, but it just needs a little bit so that the white of your house is actually white, for example, and the yellowy browny tones at the top are not ruined by the white balance. Cool, so when you've done that, I'm just going to add a little bit of exposure. It doesn't need a huge amount, maybe a third of a stop or slightly less. Slightly less seems to be okay. Then I would set your white point slightly off. There we go, slightly brighter. And your black point looks like it's about good. So that is absolutely fine. And then I might add a little bit more contrast and a little bit of dehaze just to... Now, remember, it's going to dehaze is obviously going to reduce the amount of cloud that you've got going on, but it's also going to add definition. So I would add a little bit because it's not going to remove the cloud situation at the top, but it's going to help cut through to get to these the housing a little bit more. So yeah, that would be my my editing suggestions and the photography suggestions for this picture. Hope you found that useful. On to the next one. So we've got Bernard now, who was featured in my last image review. He sent a couple more pictures to look at. Here we've got a sort of seascape, looks like a long exposure image. And then we'll be finishing off with an environmental portrait. So what do I think of this? I like this, would be my first response. I think the long exposure has worked well, other than the fact that I'd love to see the tide obviously closer up to you, because then you'll get more dominant reflections and you get the smooth water. Might maybe would have made for a nicer frame than you've got at the moment, but considering the conditions, you can't control the tide. I think it's really well done. The two things I'd suggest are, in terms of the edit, because I think the photography is pretty much executed well, are how dark it is, and potentially a crop. So the crop I'll go through first, because that maybe just me that wants it cropped like this, but I might consider going to a 3:2 just to make it slightly less boxy. and go for something like that to make it a little bit more about the pier, and just removing that island on the left that doesn't feel like it necessarily needs to be there. And then what should we do? So yeah, so I think this crop works for me. And then the other thing, the obvious thing for me, is that the exposure is too dark. So I'll just be bringing that up by about a stop. And then having brought that up, you'd need to correct your highlights again. But the overall image is too dark without bringing the exposure up. So I just look at rebalancing these tones again so that you're not losing your color and all of that, but you are just bringing a little bit more detail out there. Let's check our blacks. So blacks are about right. That's not too bad. Yeah, so that's maybe where I'd sit. I'd love to see that from the raw when you're done, with a full resolution file. I think you could do lots with this picture. Photography is really good. Maybe you could have had a look at using this as a leading line more. You may have got versions that are like that, but I don't dislike, the way you've shot it, the decision you made with how you photographed it. So good work on that one. So, and onto the final image. We've got looks like it could very easily be even in Switzerland or something. I don't know whether it's because of images I've seen before, but yeah, a lovely moment captured with amazing light. Are my first reactions. It's emotive, it's powerful. The expression is great. The fact that he's not looking at camera, I think, is actually really nice. It puts a man in with his environment. You make it, whether he is or not, you believe it's him and his sheep, or goats, or whatever they are. And yeah, and then he has catch lights in his eyes to really bring his eyes out. Yeah, this image has so much going for it. It's a really nice sort of lifestyle environmental portrait. So really, really well done on the capture. Your exposure is good. Good camera work. I don't know what the metadata is for this, but it looks like the depth of field is relatively wide. Just based on the fact that these guys aren't very blurred, but then it's also probably not on a particularly long focal length lens either, just because of the way that the image and the size of his head looks, for example. So it's probably shot on something like 35mm, maybe a 50, with f8 to f11, something like that. That's got him really sharp, and then these guys are still, they're not really fully out of focus. They are out of focus, but they're not blurred as you'd get with a shallower depth of field. So yeah, well done on that. The edit is where I think we could see some improvement. My initial reaction is, one, it's slightly too bright, and two, too much, slightly overdone color and too much clarity. Finding the balance between all of the sliders is really important, because I think in this image it's just slightly overdone with it being a little bit unreal. Like the green feels a little bit too green, and lots of the saturation of the colors, except for seemingly red, have been taken out of his face through the clarity. So you've added clarity, which has added sort of the texture in his beard and in his hat, which is nice. But has added sort of a strange haloing, color damaging effect. So I would just look at rebalancing your sliders again. So in here, I'm just going to reduce the exposure a little bit, not by too much, just by minus 0.1 of a stop, just to take the sort of edge off of it a little bit. And then I would look at reducing the clarity. So in here, I'm just going to go to minus 30. When I'm working on a raw file, I almost never use minus in clarity. It will only be 1% of my pictures or something that I go into the minus in clarity. But I often leave clarity at 0, or at least less than 10. As going above that can just make for some very strange effects on your photos. So I would just look at it. It won't look the same as on your raw by me reducing it when it's already been applied. But I would just look at leaving your clarity slider at 0 or closer to 0. So for me, I'm just going to reduce the clarity to minus 30 for this picture. And the other thing I will do is I'm going to go down to my HSL color sliders. Hue, I'm going to grab this tool, which is going to let me adjust the yellow and green at the same time, and maybe just find somewhere. Ooh, there we go. Let's just find somewhere that is a little bit less. So now we know which ones it is. I'm just going to reduce the yellow and reduce the green to add a little bit more yellow into this. And then in saturation, I'm going to do similarly. Not too much. We still want it to be a colourful picture. We just don't want it to be overdone. Right. Now, so maybe to compensate the exposure, I'm just going to increase the highlights slightly, because I think that's good. Let's just check our white point. So white is very bright, so let's drop that. Let's drop it a little bit. And then blacks, let's add a little bit more black to add a bit more pop into him. Having done that, you might consider resetting your exposure and just not having the change, because I think balancing these other sliders has done most of what you needed it to do. And yeah, so I'd really just look at your clarity slider and your vibrance and saturation just to see what you've done with the colors. But yeah, I think, with those small tweaks, that can really help this. The other thing, you might consider adding a vignette to this picture. Not too heavy. Let's just go to about just over 10, something like that. 13, something like that's pretty good. Just take some of the highlights out of the corners, like dampen them a little bit, and make it really about him and the animals. But you don't have to do that. That's just a sort of a creative decision there. Okay, and that rounds up the image review for this video. If you've got any images that you want to send in to be critiqued, to have me sort of go over your edit process, then please send them to review@masterthelight.co.uk, and I'll make sure I feature them in a future video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.